Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we're taking another deep dive into a Primarch planet. So we're going to be venturing into the dark, claustrophobic tunnels of one of the most infamous worlds in the Warhammer 40k mythos. Today we're talking about Cthonia. And if you're a fan of the lore, you know that this isn't just any floating rock in the vast emptiness of space. This was the crib and cradle of the arch-betrayer himself, Horus Lupercal, and the ancient home of the Luna Wolves. But before it was a legend, it was a nightmare. A planet hollowed out by greed and industry, to the point that it literally couldn't hold itself together quite right. Cthonia wasn't some far-flung alien world on the edge of the galaxy. In fact, it was practically in Earth's backyard, located within Segmentum Solar, meaning that you could literally get there with a hop and a skip on almost any spacefaring vessel. Because it was so close to Terra, it was the very first place humans reached when they started poking their heads into the stars. But being first comes at a price. For millennia, humanity mined, tunneled, and scraped Cthonia for every last crumb of natural resources it had to offer. By the time the Adeptus Mechanicus showed up to reclaim the ancient tech on the world, the planet was essentially a discarded shell. It was deemed as a redundant world, a volcanic, crumbling ruin filled with exhausted mines and rotting scraps of industry. A dying industrial world, if you will. Imagine living on a planet that the sun is seen more as a myth than reality. The entirety of your existence is spent within a labyrinthian maze of dark tunnels and metal-clung ravines. This was the life of the average Chthonian, with the surface of the world being ruled by the cruel logic of the Mechanicum's envoys. The remaining 2 billion people of the world were pushed into the subsurface, basically upside-down built hive spires, eventually being deemed as a feral world with a high-tech graveyard. This society would come to be ruled by something known as the Law of the Blade, where vicious gangs ruled in the dark, fighting in endless bloody wars over the scraps they could turn in for profit and resources. These people were tough, pale, with craggy faces, and what little markers of light or life they had was freckles made due to the uneven intensity of artificial light. They even had a massive volcanic cavern at the planet's heart, which served as a communal pyre for their dead. It was referred to at one point as a nest of serpents, particularly in the records of early Imperial explorers. And seeing how things turned out in the long run, they weren't exactly wrong. However, the trajectory of Cthonia changed forever when a single gestation pod landed on it. This pod had one of the Emperor's super babies inside of it, and it was launched from his secret lab in Terra with a combination of the scheming from the 4 gibbering gods of chaos and one of the universe's worst mothers, one who had no plan, not even a concept of a plan of where her kids would end up. Inside this gestation pod was young Horus, who would end up growing up in this brutal environment where he wouldn't just survive, he would thrive, as he mastered the art of gang warfare and cutthroat politics that thrived within the tunnels, which is probably why he became such a master tactician and able to schmooze anyone he met later on. When the Emperor finally found him, Horus became the first Primarch to be officially rediscovered, and Cthonia became a recruitment ground for the Luna Wolves Legion, which means the Emperor took this very same gang of violent men, individuals who knew nothing but war and loyalty to their packs, and turned them into some of the most feared and revered space marines in the entirety of the galaxy. But as we know, the story of Horus may start with glittering gold, but it ends in fire and brimstone. And so does the story of his home. During the Horus Heresy, Cthonia would become a symbol of everything that went wrong. It was blockaded and besieged for years by the Imperial Fists. However, in a weird irony, the Fists actually started to recruit from the Chthonian gangs themselves in order to fight back against the Sons of Horus, meaning that the world ended up in a tug of war between brothers until the very end of its existence. And in the aftermath of the Heresy, during the Great Scouring, Cthonia was finally destroyed. Some say the Dark Angels cracked it wide open and blasted the remains into oblivion to wipe away the stain of treason. Others say the planet simply gave up and its structural integrity finally failed after thousands and thousands of years of being hollowed out and mined. Today, Cthonia is not but a memory in a field of dust and debris, which is a fitting end to the birthplace of the galaxy's greatest civil war. And this is where the story of Cthonia gets kind of weird, and honestly somewhat unsettling. When we talk about the Primarchs, we usually have these grandiose epic sagas such as Guilliman on Macragge, Russ on Fenris, and Sanguinius on Baal. But Horus, the golden boy of the Imperium, when looking into his past, we see surprisingly little. And what we do have is rather messy. It's almost like someone didn't want the full truth of it all to get out. Or maybe the truth was actually just too grim. We know for sure that the Emperor found Horus first, at least if we discount, and due to it being Alfarius, we can't particularly say if anything involving his statements or the statements of his early life are true or false. What we do know is that Horus did in fact lead his Luna wolves almost from the jump, to the point that the time it took for him to be placed in full leadership was so short that there seemed to be almost no transition period. But the how and the where of this first meeting is where the trail gets colder than a cold case file. To understand why the records are so shoddy, you have to look at the state of Cthonia itself. This wasn't just a tough neighborhood, and it wasn't a bleak world with a few shining exemplars. It was a literal dead husk. Because it was so close to Terra, humanity had been digging into it since before they even figured out warp travel. By the time of the Great Crusade, the planet was a hollowed out corpse. Some scholars think that the tech priests of Mars were the ones who originally stripped the planet bare, while others whisper about an ancient, forgotten star kingdom that just seemingly vanished overnight, leaving nothing but dust and empty tunnels. In essence, a lot of Cthonia was an orphan world, left to entropy and decay during the long age of strife. During the darkness, before even the great long age of strife ever hit the galaxy. Now there's conflicting versions of Horus's very own childhood, and things are somewhat difficult because both stories seem rather plausible in terrifying ways. The first version is the one most people on Cthonia believed, was that Horus was a foundling and he supposedly crashed into the dark oxygen-starved tunnels of the world as a baby, growing up amongst the kill gangs. Basically the Tot grew up as a demigod, learning to be a gangster, understanding how to throat punch someone into submission long before he could even speak sentences. This version says that he mastered the law of the blade and became the ultimate gang leader long before the Emperor descended upon the world like a god, sent to reclaim his heir. This would be the classic King of the Slums story. But then there's a second version, and this one changes everything. Some high-level Imperial scholars have claimed that Horus actually never grew up on Cthonia. Instead, they say that he was found almost immediately and actually grew up at the Emperor's side on Terra. In this version, he wasn't a scavenger. He was a prince who would eventually play pauper, only to become the prince again. Records state that he was there for the forging of the first alliance on Mars and the conquest of the Sol system proper, as he was the only Primarch who truly knew the Emperor as a father, not just as a master, which would make the Emperor's reluctance to outright slay Horus during the Heresy more understandable. So which was it? Was he the gutter-born king of a dead world, or was he groomed as an heir to the galactic throne, only placed on Cthonia for a few short years in order to get the world to quickly ally with him? In reality, the truth is buried under 10,000 years of propaganda, myth, and at this point, we may never know what the Warmaster truly saw when he first opened his eyes, and the atmosphere started to fail. Anyone with a ticket out of the world headed straight for Terra. What was left behind was the ultimate social experiment in restraint chaos. These weren't just unhappy citizens. They were a people that had completely detached themselves from the idea of a civilization proper. There was no government, no police, and 100% no mercy. There was only the law of the blade. In the pitch black tunnels and the lightless heart of the planet, if you couldn't defend yourself and your property, you wouldn't have anything for long. It was a classic might makes right trope, but turned up to 11 because, well, it's Warhammer and Warhammer is going to Warhammer. The crazy part was how this anarchy actually organized itself, which, if you understand what anarchy means, organization seems to kind of contradict anarchy. You had these barbarian kings who rose up out of the filth and mire, claiming entire networks of tunnels as sovereign territory. They didn't just aim to survive, they wanted to rule and thrive, being the greatest king in a heap of trash. They would then demand tribute from anyone passing through these areas and build bizarre fortified enclaves in the ruins of ancient factories. It was a weird mix of high-tech debris, and primitive feudalism, creating a rather unique aesthetic. These gang leaders would hold on to power through absolute brutality, bonding men and women to their service through blood oath. For a few months, you might be king on Cthonia, but on Cthonia, the crown usually meant a target was placed directly on your back. But then you had these groups that didn't care about territory at all. These are the ones who really gave the Imperium the creeps when they first got there. You had these roving gangs of nomadic killers who lived entirely on plunder and pillaging. They didn't want to build anything. They didn't want to grow a power base. They just wanted blood and power, and they would harvest it however they could. Gangs of them would raid and burn entire sectors just because they could, or call the weak from their own ranks in order to maintain an anarchic order. Always lurking in the periphery, they would be as specters. These killers would move in total silence, murdering for whatever reason they had in a manner that no one truly understood. They weren't after food, ammunition, or even glittering gold. They were after something else entirely: entertainment. It was a fluid and terrifying web of shifting loyalties, where factions would rise and vanish within the span of a fortnight. You had to think a society like this would just blink out of existence, right? In a world where everyone is killing each other, the population count should have hit zero terrifyingly quickly. But that's the weird magic of Cthonia. It's that these murderous strains of humanity didn't just survive, they thrived. They were seemingly multiplying like rabbits. The constant violence acted like a brutal evolutionary filter and an aphrodisiac all in one. Only the strongest, the fastest, and the most ruthless would survive long enough to have kids, and their kids, however they were made, would be just as, if not more brutal, more cunning, and more ruthless. By the time the Emperor arrived, he didn't find a broken people waiting to be saved. He found a planet-sized army of natural-born killers who had been perfected and raised within the art of urban warfare for years. The irony is that Cthonia didn't endure despite the murder. It endured because of it. So when the Emperor got there and looks at this hollowed out nightmare of a rock, he did not see a tragedy. He saw a veritable gold mine, but he wasn't looking for iron ore or gold to bling himself out. He was looking for the only resource Cthonia had in abundance: killers. By the time of the Great Crusade, somewhere around 800 M30, the Imperium was now hungry for soldiers at an ever-increasing pace, and Cthonia was a planet-sized factory for the most hardened, cynical survivors the galaxy had ever met. These were people who didn't need to be told the universe was a cold, scary, and dark place, as they had been living in the dark with monsters their entire lives. Because Cthonia was so close to Terra, it became one of the first stops for the early expeditionary fleets. And they didn't come with olive branches, rather they came with shackles. There are these imperial reports which are honestly rather chilling when you stop to think about them. They describe recruitment squads descending into the tunnels and harvesting the population. And we're talking about tens of thousands of gang members being rounded up and chained together, stuffed into dark holes of prison shuttles, then shipped off-world. Most of these people ended up as imperial troopers, which is just a fancy way of saying they were forced into the Imperial Army as meat shields and bullet sponges. But the absolute best of these violent, pale-faced gangers were sent to the gene laboratories on Luna, as they weren't being recruited, but rather they were being processed. On Luna, these gangers and the gang leaders themselves, along with the tunnel fighters, were handed over to the gene rights to be ripped apart and put back together again as transhuman weapons. This is how the Luna Wolves really found its identity, as most of the early Space Marine legions were just volunteers and recruits from Terra itself. But the Chthonians brought something different: a raw, feral ferocity and an identity all their own that couldn't just be taught. Even after all the hypno-indoctrination and psychological conditioning, the Chthonian streak seemed to remain, even in the records of the Imperium. They were ferociously powerful individuals who fought with a pack-like mentality, making them arguably one of the, if not the most effective legions in the early crusade. They were seen by many as the Emperor's chosen sons, but they were forged from the literal dregs of a dying world that was nary a husk of humanity. It wasn't just the Space Marines either. The Chthonians' reputation for brutality spread throughout the regular military too, and it directly led to the creation of the elite of the Scholar Auxilia, known as the Chthonian Headhunters. Just from the name alone, you know that these guys weren't the ones you sent on peacekeeping missions to just take a tally of the war crimes being committed around you while you waited to be extracted. They were the elite, they were vastly effective, and they were terrifying. Also, it's a bit of foreshadowing for where the story is really going when you learn that when the Horus Heresy finally broke out and the Warmaster turned traitor against his father, every single one of these headhunter cohorts sided with Horus. The loyalty to the pack and the law of the blade ran deeper than just culture. It was almost genetic at that point. And so they would turn away from their loyalty to a distant golden throne into the ever open arms of chaos. So when the emperor had finally met his first son, or at least who were told is a first son, it was actually just the two of them for an exceedingly long amount of time. Because Horus's homeworld was the one closest to Terra compared to his brothers, he was recovered while he was still relatively young. And while it may sound weird, calling someone who's somewhere around his 40s to his 60s young, after this, for around 30 years, Horus was the Emperor's only true heir. Think about this. Two of the most powerful beings in the galaxy were just hanging out perpetually with only realistically themselves to bond with. This meant that the Emperor, one of the most powerful and brilliant minds ever to have existed, was personally mentoring Horus, who had previously grown up as a ganger on Cthonia, teaching him the potential for humanity, building a bond that he believed was truly unbreakable. When the Emperor gave Horus the command of his legion, he wasn't giving him a military force. He was giving him 10,000 true sons made from his own DNA, many of whom were those same Chthonian gangers who had been collected earlier. For 3 decades, they were the ultimate duo, bringing further and further glory to this hollowed out husk of humanity, in an odd reflection of what the Emperor was trying to do with a greater humanity through the Imperium. They forged an Imperium side by side and a golden age, which would get kind of horrible once this fairy tale as we know it inevitably ended, as all things do in Warhammer, in one of the most devastating civil wars of human history. The Horus Heresy, in less than a decade, left everything the Emperor and Horus built set on fire. Eventually, Horus does die, as the arch traitors usually do, and the Emperor was entombed in the Golden Throne, leaving the sons of Horus to flee like dogs with their tails between their legs. Led by First Captain Ezekiel Abaddon, they would retreat into the Eye of Terror, where the Legion basically went through 10,000 years of an identity crisis, eventually rebranding as the Black Legion, a twisted, dark version of their former selves that doesn't serve a world like Cthonia or the Emperor. They didn't even have a homeworld anymore, as they were permanently stationed in an ancient battle barge deep within the warp, along with a series of warships captured from the Imperial Navy, wandering through the void as a permanent threat to the species they once protected. And what about Cthonia itself? If you're looking for it on any star chart from the 41st millennium, you won't find a planet anymore. You'll find an asteroid field. The scientific explanation for this is that the planet finally lost its geostructural integrity after years of harvesting and wars going on its surface. Humanity had mined it so aggressively down to its very dead core that it just eventually fell apart. There's even a theory where the original population were just maintenance teams meant to keep it from completely crumbling. And once proper warfare hit, the maintenance of the world stopped and the math of gravity took over. But there's also the much more imperial theory, and that is that the planet was destroyed during the Great Scouring, like many of the Primarch worlds were as well. The Imperium wanted to erase every trace of Horus, any place where the arch-traitor and his kin could be worshipped or aggrandized, turning the birthplace of the Warmaster into a graveyard of floating rocks that no one could ever use as a symbol of rebellion again. But before the end, Cthonia was a landscape of grim and industrial wonders. You had the Great Lupercal's Gate, an immense hive city that the Imperials later renamed Traitor's Gate, just to twist the knife in deeper before the world got blasted into oblivion. There was also the Terminal Atlas, a space elevator from the dark age of technology that acted as a literal bridge to the stars, and the Titan Yards, which, despite its name, actually spent most of its time churning out Lehman Russ tanks, rather than Titans proper. This world had been so industrialized that it was riddled with entrance points to the dark underworld, like the Unclock Chasm and the Serpent's Jaws, leading down to subterranean fortresses like the Tyrant's Den, where Horus had based many of his operations within the planet. It was a world of prison cohorts and the Vorhek Mountains, a place that was already dying long before the first bombs were ever dropped upon its surface. It's unsettlingly strange to think the cradle of humanity's greatest hero and greatest monster is now nary dust in the wind of the stars, lying in silence. But yeah, that's the story of Cthonia. It's an incredibly bleak circular tragedy. You have a world that was literally hollowed out by humanity's greed until nothing but a shell was left. And then, from the darkest corner of humanity's leftovers, the Emperor pulls out his golden sun. A man intended to save the galaxy, but instead of saving it, Horus just became a reflection of the world he came from. He took that hollowed out, broken nature and spread it across the stars, turning the entire Imperium and humanity itself into followers of the law of the blade, the very nightmare he supposedly grew up in. And at the end of the day, it's almost poetic, as Cthonia doesn't exist anymore, whether it fell apart because of how much humanity took from it, or because the Imperium burned away every evidence of its failure thanks to the traitor Primarchs. It leaves us with something more haunting. It is a field of nameless rocks floating where a legacy once used to be. It is the ultimate reminder that in 40k, everything that seems legendary, even the homes of the Primarchs, can be erased and be just another ghost floating in the dark. But I think this is a good place to leave off. I hope you guys enjoyed this deep dive into the veritable nest of serpents that was Cthonia. If you stayed with me this long, I do have to say, liking and leaving comments not only lets me know what you like, but it also informs me on what other things to look into, all the while helping me in the algorithm. And if you would like to stay up to date with what I post, subscribing is awesome. Thank you, and I do hope you tune back in later.